I'm Sheila Schroeder. I lead business development for Private Ocean Wealth Management, and I am here today with Stephanie Kay. Stephanie is a registered nutritionist, and typically we do informational sessions on financial issues. But with everything that's going on today in our world, we really thought it would be just so much fun to be able to have a conversation about nutrition and the nutrition stress connection. So I'm going to be leading a group of questions for Stephanie, and she's also promised to provide for us 5 key takeaways that that we can all leave with at the end. So let's start with the first question. Well, first, Stephanie, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And yes, I promise we will get 5 key takeaways by the time we're done today.
That's great. I know I'm going to need them. So let's start with the first question, which is, how does stress impact the body?
Yeah. So like you said, such a timely topic for everything that's going on right now. Stress is such a big topic of conversation, but I think what's really important so that we're all on the same page for this discussion is that we really start with the basics and understand exactly what stress is. So at the most basic level, stress is a disturbance in the body's state of homeostasis. So essentially, homeostasis is when we're relaxed, for lack of a better description. All of our systems, our digestive system, our immune system, our nervous system, our respiratory system, all of these different systems in the body are functioning optimally. So stress is a disturbance in all of these or any of these different systems. The thing that I really want to point out is the idea that not all stress is necessarily bad. And this might come a little bit as a shock to people because we typically hear the word stress and we have a negative connotation immediately. But stress can be beneficial in specific moments or during specific periods. So to give you an example of how the stress response in the body could be beneficial is if you were to hypothetically be attacked by a bear. Now, being attacked by the bear is not a good thing, but your body's stress response to increase your cortisol, get your adrenaline going, to get you away from that bear, that is an example of how stress can be a beneficial response by the body or a positive response, for lack of a better description. Another example might be you're preparing for a first date or you're preparing for a job interview. It's basically helping you or motivating you to deal with a specific situation. Now, on the flip side, where stress can become problematic or quote unquote bad is when there is stress repeatedly occurring over and over again, or it occurs in excess. So obviously, if you were always being attacked by a bear or always prepping for a job interview, that might not be ideal. And that's when we can flip the term, as opposed to bad, if you will, more chronic stress. And that's where things really become problematic, when it's ongoing, repeated over and over and over again.
So you've talked about like sort of what is stress and the basics. And you've talked a little bit, about why stress really does have a positive place. And I'd love to hear more about how stress impacts the body. So you've identified it. So how does that impact us every day?
Yeah,
or long term?
Yeah, absolutely. So another important thing to point out is that stress can both be a physical occurrence and a psychological or mental occurrence. The body can't distinguish whether it's occurring physically or mentally. So it perceives it or interprets it the same way. So for example, if you're stressed about something to do with the family, or you're stressed about your finances, for example, your body will perceive that stress the same way as if, the bear were attacking you, to go back to that analogy. Now, regardless of what the situation is, whether it's psychological or physical, the way that the body interprets that or what happens is actually the same response. So what occurs is we have a built-in alarm system that is there for evolutionary purposes. And that built-in alarm system is cortisol. That's one of the hormones in our body. And most people have heard of cortisol before. When we are going through a period of stress, it's released in higher and more frequent amounts to help kind of like signal to us like something's going on here. This is not ideal. You need to essentially deal with it, whether it's acute or chronic or whatever may be occurring. Now, it's also important to note that the body naturally produces cortisol. So again, cortisol can both be beneficial and problematic depending on whether that stress is acute or chronic or ongoing. So the way that cortisol naturally helps us is really simple. It actually helps to regulate our sleep and wake cycles. So we're waking up in the morning, and then it's peaking midday. So that's when we're super productive. And then it starts to dip in the afternoon. So maybe we're getting a little bit more tired. And then it tapers off into the evening when it's time to go to bed. It also helps to regulate our blood pressure, keep inflammation down, and actually ensure that the body can utilize the carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and nutrients in our food. Now, that is when it's working for us, or it's being our friend, for lack of a better description. On the flip side, it can become more problematic or not necessarily be our friend when we're having that chronic ongoing stress. So it will disrupt our sleep cycles. So if you've ever been through a stressful period, which I would argue most of us have, sometimes you have trouble falling asleep, or you don't get good quality sleep, or you wake up tired, or you wake up multiple times during the evening. You may have also experienced that when you go through a stressful period, your hunger cues start to change, right? Like you start craving different foods, or you want more food, or you find yourself hungrier than usual. And in addition to that, it can also disrupt, weaken our digestive system, weaken our immune system when it's chronic and ongoing and always high, the cortisol. And then it can also cause weight gain or make weight loss more difficult. So that is essentially what physiologically happens when we experience stress, especially that chronic ongoing stress.
Wow, that demystifies what's going on. I definitely have been feeling that during the pandemic, where I have these like cortisol rushes, and I didn't know what it was. And then in talking to you and understanding that that's a stress, like literally that's a stress hormone response, it certainly makes me feel less alone.
Yes.
That it's not some weird thing. So you talked a little bit about like the food connection and why cortisone and stress can trigger this, passion suddenly for every flavor of potato chip, for example.
Yes.
So could we maybe talk a little bit more about what kind of food choices and how what food choices we make sort of plays into a way for us to manage stress more effectively?
Yes, absolutely. And I think you actually raised a great point, is that stress doesn't always have to be one massive big bang occurrence, right? It's the accumulative daily things that occur. So maybe you, for example, woke up past your alarm and you don't have time to have breakfast, so you rush to your first meeting, right? Then you have a busy day at work all day. Then something happens with your kids and you have to go deal with that. Then, oh my goodness, I've got to make dinner, right? Then, oh my good, and it just adds up. You're also stressed about a family situation and finance. So it's all these little things that add up. So it doesn't always have to feel like a big thing. And unfortunately, what's happening right now in the world is a perfect example of that, right? So just to note on that. So in terms of your next question about where diet fits in, that's a phenomenal question. And to help elaborate on that, I'm just going to take a second to share some slides with everyone, because I think it will help with a visual reference. So what I've got here is a little something that is referred to as the food-mood connection. So this is really how the stress that we experience, whether it's psychological or physical, is linked or connected to our diet. So if you've heard the food-mood connection before, phenomenal. It's also a little bit of a reference to your gut. So your digestive system, the area that breaks down all of your food, is actually referred to your second brain. So what's really interesting, and there's a plethora of research that has come out in the recent years, and it's kind of, I don't want to say baffled, but I'll say baffled the scientific community. And it's been really interesting as they're learning more about it. There's still a lot more to discover. But essentially what they've learned is that the bacteria in your gut, or what's going on in your digestive tract, for lack of better description, impacts your mental state, so your emotions and your mood and how you're feeling, and vice versa. So they're actually completely linked. So if I give you an example of a situation where that a lot of people have probably experienced, where maybe you're, about to do a public speaking engagement, or you're nervous about something and you get butterflies in your stomach, that's a really simple example of the food mood connection, or the gut brain connection. Now, part of the reason why this is happening is because all of the bacteria, and if you've heard the word probiotics before, that is essentially what I'm referring to. So it's all of this beneficial bacteria that lives in our gut or lives in our digestive tract. It actually helps to produce, manufacture some of our mood boosting hormones, or mood boosting neurotransmitters. So 80% of our serotonin, which helps to boost our mood, and 50% of our dopamine, which is essentially like our feel good neurotransmitter, all of these things are housed in the gut. So what we eat is going to influence the behaviors of these neurotransmitters. So I keep referencing the gut, and I just want to make this clear. I'm not talking about the thing that hangs over your pants when you put them on. It's the actual components of your digestive tract. So everything from your small intestine to your large intestine to your actual stomach and your pancreas. And what has been discovered through all this research that I've been discussing is that this is really the root of our health. And although we unfortunately kind of think of our bodies like carburetors, we just kind of like eat what feels good and then my body will deal with it. What we've actually discovered is that the food that you eat is impacting this bacteria, these probiotics, these beneficial bacteria in your gut, and that in turn is impacting your mental state. So a really popular quote is one that says, all disease begins in the gut. And that's a quote by Hippocrates. But another way that I like to look at it, or a different way that I like to share it, is the idea that a healthy garden needs a healthy soil. So if you have ever planted a garden, planted a flower, or seen a flower, for lack of a better description, you will understand that in order for a flower to grow and flourish, it needs a healthy, nutrient-dense soil. If you're planting it in rocks, or you're planting it in sand, or you're planting it in poor quality soil, it might grow, but in none of these situations will it flourish. And that is the same thing that happens with the human body. So the quality of our soil, which is our gut bacteria, our microbiome, our probiotics, is what is going to determine whether we are flourishing, for lack of better description. So when it comes to food or diet and stress, diet is in fact both a symptom and a source of stress. So it's kind of a catch-22. And if you've experienced stress and you've seen how it impacts your hunger, you'll totally get this. But once we become stressed, our cortisol starts to go up, our hunger cues start changing. We start looking for maybe what I would refer to as more processed food, or less optimal food choices, whether it's candy or chips or sugar or whatever it may be. And consuming those things kind of compounds the issue, because that's also a form of stress on the body, because it's stressing your gut bacteria, and then you're not getting enough nutrients, so it creates more stress. So the long and short answer there is that it's both a symptom and a cause of stress when it comes to your diet or to your food choices.
Stephanie, thank you for that. When we were talking before, you were talking about probiotic versus antibiotic.
Yeah.
It's so funny. I had never made that connection before, and yet probiotic, antibiotic, it completely
Yeah.
makes sense. And And one of the things I found just fascinating about our talk is just when we're thinking about that gut, we were talking about like what foods or factors, really impact that food mood connection or our second brain. And I'd love for you to talk about nurturing that gut, like, and if we're taking antibiotics, what kind of foods should we be taking to increase the probiotics in our gut?
Yes, absolutely. So the first way that we'll look at it is kind of understanding what foods negatively impact our second brain or our gut microbiome or our probiotics. And you can use those words interchangeably, if you will. So there's both diet factors and lifestyle factors that are going to impact this. So I'll start first with diet. So looking at food choices at different foods, and these probably won't be surprising, but a diet too high in refined sugars or processed carbohydrates, essentially any type of refined food or processed food that is packed with artificial additives rather and preservatives, is going to negatively impact our gut health and influence the amount and quality of probiotic bacteria going on in our gut. Other things that can negatively influence it are not eating a diet that's high enough in fiber, consuming too many vegetable oils, or alcohol consumption in excess. By no means am I saying we need to avoid that completely. And then looking at lifestyle factors, not only the food that we put in our mouth, but our behavior, because it's a two-way system, our behavior also impacts our second brain or our gut health. So, these are also quite common things when it comes to general health: is lack of exercise, lack of activity, lack of sleep, and also lack of sunlight all impact our gut microbiome. And then to your point earlier about the antibiotics, is use of short-term or long-term antibiotics will kill off, if you will, some of that beneficial bacteria, because antibiotics, which I am not recommending that you don't take, if you need to consume them for medical reasons, please do so. But understand that when you're taking those products or that medication, in the process, it is going to kill off any bacteria. Antibiotics cannot tell the difference whether it's beneficial bacteria, so probiotics, or bad bacteria that is causing issues. So essentially wipe everything out, if you will. So it's really important, if you've ever, if your diet looks like this, or you have long-term use of antibiotics, or you've even done any of these things at any point, just kind of taking note that, like, hey, this might be influencing my gut microbiome, my second brain, in a not so positive way. Because the interesting thing about our gut health is it's not just a snapshot in time. It's that it's developed or built up from the moment we are born all the way to whatever age we are now. So all of these different factors, even if you were like, oh, I took that, I was eating and drinking like that in college, or I took those antibiotics 15 years ago, they've still impacted this gut microbiome. So it's something that's important to consider.
What I wanted to ask you then is just staying on the probiotic. There are those like yogurt drinks that you can drink that have lots of probiotics. You can take pills that say that's got probiotics, and yet we've talked about like the kimchi and the kombucha. What do you think about those little pills or those sort of yogurt drinks for probiotics? Should we be drinking those to increase are they really effective?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So probiotics, I keep talking about how they just are in our gut, but it's really important to understand that you have to feed this bacteria and give it the right things that it needs. So you can consume, which I'll expand upon more later, different forms of bacteria that can help, different forms of fiber that can help to feed your probiotic bacteria, but you can also consume foods that contain probiotics. So there's essentially two different categories from the whole food perspective, it's any food that is fermented. And you mentioned some of them, whether it's kimchi, sauerkraut, or yogurt. And then you have the supplemental version. So the long and short answer is any food that is naturally fermented, in this example, the yogurt drinks that you're referring to, will contain probiotic bacteria that is beneficial. However, not all yogurt in this example that you find in the grocery store does contain probiotics. So you really want to make sure you're reading the label, reading the ingredients, and looking for an option in this yogurt example that is just milk and bacteria and contains nothing else. Because if it's, lemon cheesecake flavored yogurt or, fruit on the bottom yogurt with all this sugar, it kind of like defeats the purpose. So you're looking for real, authentic, cultured yogurt that, yes, that can absolutely add to that beneficial bacteria in your gut.
Okay, thank you for that. And that actually brings me just to pivot to a little bit before, is that, when we're stressed, I mentioned I've tried every flavor of potato chips at the grocery store at this point. I know I'm not alone.
Definitely not.
Right? And so why do we reach for certain foods when we are stressed?
Yes, that is the big question. And you're not alone and you're not losing it. There's actually physiological things that are occurring that makes us look for food when we're going through periods of stress. Now, in the short term, to come back to my silly examples, when you're being attacked by a bear, for example, you're not thinking like, oh, I need some food in this situation, right? It's fight or flight. You're trying to get away. It's an emergency. But when we're looking at that chronic, ongoing stress, in the long term, that elevated cortisol that's essentially higher than it needs to be all day long, day over day, week over week, even month over month, depending on how long or you've been experiencing stress, right? That has actually been shown to increase our appetite, and it specifically influences a hormone called leptin. So leptin is referred to as the gatekeeper of our appetite. It's basically telling, me, Steph, you're hungry, Steph, you're not hungry. It tells me when I'm full, tells me to put down my fork, right? But when cortisol is high all the time, leptin isn't functioning or operating at an optimal level. So it's basically like gone on vacation when cortisol is really high. So that gatekeeper of our appetite is not there. It's just not happening. So we just keep consuming, not only because leptin is gone, but because it's self-soothing. And because those high sugar, high salt, high fat, high carbohydrate foods, they actually release a dopamine response in the human body. So that feel good neurotransmitter, that reward neurotransmitter. And food manufacturers, so the people in the plants coming up with the Oreo flavors and the Dorito flavors or whatever it is, the chip flavors, they're actually trying to create foods that meet something called the bliss point. So you may have heard that before. So it's this point where the food is hitting your taste buds at the most perfect combination of salt, of sugar, and of fat. So it's giving you the biggest dopamine response possible. And our bodies remember that. So our bodies remember, right, when I was going through stress, we had that dopamine response because she ate that thing. So every time that stress happens again, that is what our brain starts to veer towards, right? Because it knows that it gets that self-soothing, feel good, even though it might be only momentarily, it might be minutes, it might be 30 minutes, it might be an hour, right? But it remembers that moment of how good you felt, even if you didn't feel good, your digestion was all wonky and then you were tired and lethargic. We forget that, right? Like we just let that go. We remember that beautiful moment where the dopamine was peaking and we felt amazing.
It's so funny. I was reading a study that said you might not like Doritos, but your body likes Doritos and will call to you. And the self-soothing mechanism, sometimes you're typing away and you're mindlessly eating jelly beans or something. And having that identified as, oh, that's a self-soothing behavior really helped me stop doing it, because I'm like, oh, I'm doing this thing, and I could stop doing it. And so that insight from you was so helpful. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, sometimes just it's so small, but sometimes just knowing why you're doing something, you may not fix the behavior immediately, and arguably most people won't, right? But just knowing why, it's that knowledge is power thing, and then you can just be a little bit more mindful
Right.
about the process. So even in your example, you might still want jelly beans, you might still eat jelly beans from time to time, but maybe it'll be less, maybe it'll be more mindful, maybe it'll be half the bag as opposed to the whole bag, right? Just that little bit of knowledge or that information as to why it's happening can be really empowering in terms of behavior change.
I totally agree. Now, we have a number of questions we want to answer from our clients. However, I had one last question for you. In terms of like what dietary or lifestyle changes that we make
Yeah.
so we can manage the stress? You've talked about so many things that like identifying what it is and how it impacts our body, but I'd love to hear from you what dietary or lifestyle changes that we could make so we can actually deal with it.
Yes, for sure. Yes, this is not intended to be fear mongering. Like, here are all these problems. Good luck with it. The good news is
Right.
there are actually tactical, practical things that you can implement every day to help with this process. And again, I'm just going to share my screen quickly so that I can show some slides on this for all my visual learners out there. So I've got 5 major key takeaways. And the first one is really the biggest piece of the puzzle. So when I was putting together these takeaways to make sure that they were as impactful as possible, I was trying to pick the biggest pieces of the puzzle so that you can move the needle as much as possible, but also do it in a realistic way. So the first one is to focus on real food as much as you possibly can. So how do we define that? Again, just so we're all on the same page, is real food is one ingredient items. It's an egg, a sweet potato, a piece of spinach. They come from Mother Nature and they come from a plant or an animal. Now, why they are beneficial or why this is such an important foundational piece of the stress management puzzle is because these whole foods are the most nutrient dense foods. They are sources of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, vitamins, minerals, micronutrients, antioxidants, like all sorts of nutritional benefit. But at the same time, they're also inherently devoid of gut damaging or inflammatory or stress inducing added sugars, additives, and preservatives. So you're kind of taking care of 2 pieces of the puzzle by really just doing your best to focus on whole foods or focus on real foods. Now, I am really, really, really realistic when it comes to my approach to nutrition. And I definitely do not believe that anyone is going to eat quote unquote perfectly 100% of the time. I don't, it's just not realistic. You're going to eat some chips, you're going to eat some jelly beans, right? But it's about focusing on whole foods as much as you possibly can. So I like to use the good old fashioned 80-20 rule. If you're focusing on them 80% of the time, and then 20% of the other 20% of the time, you've got your glasses of wine, your jelly beans, your chips, to keep using these examples, it doesn't matter as much because you've built such a solid foundation in terms of your overall food quality. So that is takeaway number 1. In addition to that, to go to the next layer, if you will, is to do your best to ensure that you are eating adequate fiber in your diet. Now, hearing about fiber is not new information, but understanding why it's important for stress is going to be one of those tools that you can help to change behavior. So fiber specifically is food for the bacteria in your gut. So we were talking earlier about the importance of probiotics and how you can get probiotics through different foods or through supplementation, but you can also feed your body fiber, and the fiber naturally found in foods is literally fuel to help produce more probiotic bacteria. The recommended daily allowance for women is 25 grams per day. For men, it's 38. This is really, to be clear, a minimum. You can definitely eat more, especially if you're going through times of periods of stress. It's always important to think about topping up your system, if you will, but eating it on a regular basis will help to ensure that you're more well equipped to manage stress once it occurs, because you've really built up that probiotic bacteria. So kind of like a fun little hierarchy that I like to use, for lack of a better description, is when it comes to fiber, there's three primary sources. There's fruits, there's vegetables, and there's grain products. And you think about it in terms of priority. So ensuring that you're eating more fruits than sweeteners or sugars. I think that one kind of goes without saying. But in addition to that, ensuring that you're eating more vegetables than you are fruit. So I'll often have people come to me and be like, I'm eating super healthy. You know, I'm eating 5 pieces of fruit a day and 1 serving of vegetable. And I'm like, that's amazing, but let's just try and flip it on its head. You're going to get more beneficial fiber from the vegetables, and you'll also inherently reduce your sugar intake at the same time, which is not ideal for the bacteria in our gut. And then the last one, I like to explain it in a cheeky way. It's the idea of limiting foods that make crumbs. So if you think of any food that, like, you're dusting your shirt off a little bit or cleaning off the counter or even the couch after you've consumed it, albeit they are delicious, they are going to be a little bit more processed. So trying to focus on whole grains in their whole format. So actual oats, actual quinoa, actual rice. So those would be some examples. And further to that, again, layering on a little bit, is really trying to emphasize the protein intake in your diet. This, again, like fiber, is not new, and protein is talked about a lot in nutrition, but it is very beneficial, specifically to stress situations. And the reason for that is it really helps to regulate our appetite. And what I mean by that is it keeps us full for longer periods of time, because it helps to balance our blood sugar and keep us satiated. In addition to that, protein also contains an amino acid called tryptophan, and this is a precursor for serotonin. So it actually helps to build serotonin in our gut, which was one of those mood boosting neurotransmitters that I mentioned. And when it comes to protein sources, a really great protein intake, rather, a really great rule of thumb is just trying to ensure that you're eating a source at every single meal. So, you know, taking a look at your breakfast, taking a look at your lunch, taking a look at your dinner, and just kind of saying, like, can I tick the protein box on all of these meals? Whether it's plant-based or animal-based is completely up to you and your dietary choices, but really just making sure that you can tick that protein box. Again, like the fiber recommendation, there's a minimum requirement for protein, which is about 0.36 grams per pound of body weight. So if a woman was, for example, 160 pounds, that would be roughly just under 60 grams per day. And that's a minimum. So if you're going through a stressful period, or even if you know that you're going into a stressful period, you could increase your intake a little bit to help top up your system, if you will, because it's really going to help to be one of the things that will help to manage stress once it occurs, by giving your body the tools that it needs for its toolkit. And then this one we've spoken about a lot. So just to reiterate it, is not only are we trying to, you know, build that probiotic bacteria in our gut and make sure that it's getting the diet and lifestyle factors, but you can consume probiotics through food. So specifically fermented foods, which we talked about earlier, yogurt, kefir, sauerkraut, kimchi, pickled vegetables, tempeh, even kombucha has become a really popular beverage. If I was making this suggestion even 5 years ago, definitely 10 years ago, it would be very difficult to find these things in the grocery store, but they've become so much more popular and mainstream. You can find at least one of them, if not many of them, in just about every grocery store. One thing I do like to point out is, because food marketers are very cheeky, is there are a lot of fake probiotic foods out there. So, you know, just because they sprinkle a bit of probiotics onto your cookies or your chips doesn't make them healthier. So if you really want to get real probiotics and beneficial bacteria, ensuring that you're consuming foods that are fermented, not just like junk food that has probiotics sprinkled on top. It's not doing the same thing for you. And then last but not least is really looking at supplementation if it's needed. So you can supplement when you're going through a stressful period, when you're going into a stressful period, or even if you just feel like, you've had a stressful period and you're looking to recover. There are a number of vitamins and minerals that we could talk about that would be beneficial for stress management, but these are some that I really wanted to highlight. So I noted the supplement itself. And if you want to take the supplement, that's great. I've also noted some of the food sources where you can find these foods. So B complex and magnesium are essentially considered our stress vitamin and our anti-stress mineral. So when we go through periods of stress, these vitamins and these minerals, or this mineral rather, magnesium, are utilized by the body at a more rapid rate. So it just gets used up more quickly. So it's in our best interest to take larger doses or consume more of it through food or supplementation to make sure that we're not depleting our stores, because we really need that in the human body to fight against or manage stress. And then lastly, I've mentioned probiotics multiple times, but got that listed there. And then another thing to consider is, the lifestyle factor of sleep and how that not only affects stress, but it also affects our food choices. I think we can all agree that if you haven't slept a lot or you didn't get enough sleep, that the foods that you look for or the foods that you crave are definitely different. So you can supplement with melatonin. And melatonin basically counterbalances cortisol. So when cortisol is high, mid-morning, when we wake up in the morning, melatonin is low, and then vice versa, when cortisol starts to naturally dip, as it should, melatonin production will increase so that we can fall asleep. However, if we're chronically stressed and that cortisol level is always high, it makes it more difficult for our body to produce melatonin or enough melatonin to get us into good sleep, which is often why sleep is disrupted when you're going through stressful periods. And fortunately, supplementation of melatonin doesn't negatively influence our body's production. So there's no concern about, I'll take it and then my body just won't produce it. Your body will continue to produce it regardless.
Thank you.
No problem.
I love that. And so a couple things. One, as we promised in the beginning, we're going to send you out the 5 takeaways. And what we're going to do next is just answer some questions from our clients. I will say that I think it's pretty accurate to say that many of our clients could have a master's degree in food and nutrition. And yet I find, even though I have such a personal, deep interest in food and nutrition, hearing it from an expert like you and reinforcing, really prioritize these things, stress, you can manage it in this way. And it's just a great sort of reminder to think about like what's important. And so some of the questions I think you'll get a kick out of, I certainly appreciated them. And I want to point out before I forget that for all of you watching this, if you want to reach out to Stephanie, you can reach her at knutrition.com. And also, if you're interested in hearing topics like this, please reach out to me or Private Ocean and just let us know that you'd like to talk more about nutrition or you'd like to talk more about some other health topic, because, it really is something that we find our clients care about, and it's a fascinating topic. So I want to thank you there.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So Stephanie, let's move into some of these questions. And there's such great questions, like, how do you stop mindless late night snacking?
Oh, yes, that is a big question, isn't it? And not uncommon, right? I think that can resonate with a lot of people. For me, I think there's 2 different things to look at, even though they might both influence each other. Is it more of a behavioral thing, or is it more of a symptom of what you ate during the day? So I'll give you some examples. If you maybe grew up always having a snack after dinner, or it's what your parents did, or you've just gotten into the habit, even, it's the way that you unwind, you're kind of whether you realize it or not, you're doing that self-soothing thing, right? Like I had a busy day. Okay, I want to have like some wine and popcorn after dinner, right? Like recognizing that it might be part behavioral and that's okay. And for that reason, trying to give yourself a bit of grace in the process and realize if you've been doing something for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, even, it's not going to be like a 180 switch and you cut it out cold turkey, right? And I'll come back to elaborate on that. The other thing to consider is, are you actually hungry at that time? And if you are, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. So allow me to dispel the myth that eating at, after 7 or after 8 is completely detrimental to your health. If you're genuinely hungry, your body needs fuel and you should eat it. But if it's more of that mindless thing that we're talking about, is looking at ways to shift that behavior. And the way that I like to suggest it when I'm working with clients or just to anyone is to think about it like a transition plan. So, if you're currently, for example, consuming a bowl of ice cream every single night, and you've been doing that for a long period of time, and you're trying to get to a place where, you're not doing it, or you're doing it far less more infrequently, is figuring out how to get there. So maybe the first step is something as simple as, okay, I've been buying ice cream, but now I'm going to go to the freezer section and I'm going to buy the ice cream that has the lowest amount of sugar. So like it's still ice cream, but it's the healthiest ice cream, if you will. Then I'm going to use that for a while. Might be a week, might be a couple of weeks, might be a month. Then from there, I'm going to transition to maybe I'll buy some frozen yogurt. Okay, I'm still doing the behavior of snacking, but I'm doing it in a quote unquote healthier way. Then maybe I might transition to yogurt with fruit. Then I might transition to just fruit. Then I might transition to a cup of tea, right? Like trying to come up with a plan, if you will, or a transition plan to get there, which is, there's probably a financial analogy there.
Exactly.
And then further to that is, if you are struggling to figure out like why, something as simple as creating a bit more mindfulness and awareness around it is just keeping like a food diary or a journal. And I don't necessarily mean like you're tracking calories or like, numbers based, just really keeping it like a journal. Like, this is what I ate today. This was my mood. This is how I felt. These are the times that I ate. And if you do that for a week, 2 weeks, or even a month, you don't have to do it for the rest of your life, but you might start to identify like, oh, when I am not sleeping well, this happens. When I'm not sleeping well and I have a bad day at work, this happens, right? Like just kind of having a bit of data can also help you to change that behavior, because, humans don't like changing their behavior. So sometimes just having some information to go on can be a little bit more helpful.
Wow. I'll tell you, the analogy and the comparisons and the parallels between that and a financial plan. Oh my goodness.
Probably.
It's like, right?
Yeah.
Because we want to take you where you want to go.
Yeah.
And it's how the journey looks,
Yep.
right? What kind of choices you make and what the options
Exactly.
are.
Yeah.
So a couple more questions. I'm looking down. All right. So for example, as you said, it's 11 o'clock at night and you're thinking, oh, I want to have the snack. And you've thought about, what could I be eating during the day that might set me up so I'm not eating at 11 o'clock at night, right? So what are good foods to boost energy daily?
Yeah. I wish there was like here's the secret food that no one told you about and you need to eat more of this. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And the answer is very much, ironically, a lot of the things that I mentioned earlier. So, looking at your food quality, like, am I eating mostly whole foods as opposed to those processed foods? That's one thing to look at. But then also looking at, is the food that I'm eating well balanced across the nutrients, the macronutrients specifically? So looking at, you don't even have to do this numbers wise. You can just start visually looking at your food or thinking about what you eat. How much protein am I eating during the day? How much carbohydrates am I eating during the day? And how much fats? Like, I mean, healthy, like, avocados, olive oil, salad dressings, like healthy fats am I eating during the day? And making sure that those are well balanced. A really simple tip that I like to use is something that I call the 3 for 3 rule. So kind of looking at all 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, And just like a checklist, ensuring, okay, at lunch, at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, can I tick the carbohydrate, protein, and fats box? And that is one way which to help ensure that your energy is more stable, which might seem kind of like why or insignificant, but balancing your blood sugar and regulating your blood sugar is so important when it comes to your energy levels. And that's a great way to get started or ensure that you have a really good foundation. I'm not even mentioning things like water intake or are you sleeping well? Like there might be a larger root cause to discuss, but just kind of thinking about that 3-for-3 rule and whole foods gives you a really amazing foundation and will help to move the needle or be a big piece in the energy puzzle.
Oh, that's so helpful. I will say that I've got my like cup with water. I drink much more water when I set it up so that
Yeah,
it's
that's
right there.
a valid point that I can just comment on as well is lack of hydration or not drinking enough water or drinking, way more coffee and way less water, for example, or way more juice or soda and way less water, just ratio wise. The brain very easily gets confused between dehydration and hunger.
Mhm.
So, if you wake up in the morning, you don't have water, you have 2 cups of coffee, and then it's 2 o'clock and you're like kind of dozing off after lunch kind of thing. Yeah, you definitely are tired. And your body will probably start telling you, and your brain will probably start telling you that food mood connection, like go get some sugar because sugar is the quickest way to get energy. But just getting some water in you because you've just had 2 coffees and that's it all day, just building in that water intake is really valuable when it comes to energy.
Yeah, and I found that if I have a glass of water, sometimes I'm not hungry. I was thirsty.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
So we have a couple questions here I'd love to address that are about gut health.
Yep.
And so one of the questions is, what foods should I avoid for gut health? And then can you share what you know about gut inflammation and how nutrition can help? The gut
Yes.
inflammation, we definitely talk about that.
Yeah. So when it comes to gut health, here's a really simple way to look at things is our gut health is dependent upon the health of our digestive tract because that is essentially our gut. Now, our digestive tract obviously has a whole bunch of organs. It's like a big twisty turny thing that's going on here. But if you wanted to use a really simple analogy, your gut could essentially be described as one giant tube that starts in your mouth and we all know where it ends, but think of it like a giant tube that is made out of sponge. So like a kitchen sponge. So essentially what happens when we consume food is that sponge is, it's tightly closed and it's there. And as we eat food, all of the food that we break down, that we chew, that we digest, now our body starts looking for, okay, where are the proteins? Where are the fats? Where are the vitamins? Where are the minerals? And our body or our bloodstream will take that through the sponge, or those nutrients will go through the sponge into our bloodstream so they can go wherever it's needed in the body. Now that sponge at the same time ensures that any inflammatory things, any toxins, any unhealthy things leave our body through either the skin, through sweating, through breathing, or through a bowel movement. Now, the reason I wanted to explain that is to understand essentially how the gut works and how it protects us from the bad stuff and lets the good stuff in. So the answer to the question, what are foods that can irritate the gut lining, I really alluded to them earlier. It's the refined sugars, the vegetable oils, the additives, the preservatives. Essentially, it's the chemicals in our food. Now, in addition to that, you're also going to have to consider things like excess alcohol consumption. You can also consider environmental pollution, like there are other things, but if we're specifically talking about foods, it's additives, it's preservatives, it's vegetable oils, it's refined sugars. Now, to go an extra layer is depending on the individual, and this is where it gets a bit more specific to the person, so I'll just speak generally, is certain foods can irritate an individual's gut and may not irritate someone else's. So having a food allergy or having a food intolerance. For example, there are specific vegetables who, for some people, not everyone, the nightshade vegetables, the tomatoes, the potatoes, the peppers, those can be inflammatory or irritate an individual's gut. Dairy for some people can irritate the gut lining. And essentially what happens is over time is that sponge that is keeping the good stuff in and allowing the bad stuff to leave, it starts to get holes in it, which is referred to as leaky gut or gut intestinal permeability. And that's when the things that should be leaving the body, the toxin, the things that should leave through bowel movements or sweating, start seeping into the bloodstream, and things can become more inflammatory. And that might present in one person as rosacea on the skin. It might present in another person in terms of joint pain. So it's a little bit vague, I know, but the reason for that is the way that gut health works is the same for everyone, but what foods affect your gut health negatively, although like processed foods are going to affect us all negatively, specific other foods can affect different people differently. And it's really important to consider that we are all individual. So that's why diet is very individual.
Well, I love that. Let me end with this. Is there any question I haven't asked you?
Oh my goodness.
that maybe I should have asked you. We got so many great questions. I'm looking to see. We've talked about mindless snacking. We've talked about supplements and craving salty things, boosting energy. What else? Yeah, is there? Well, I don't. Maybe we could just touch on this one. Would love thoughts for like fast and easy vegetarian answers to nutrition, because I think a lot of us, well, not so much on the Bay Area because everybody's so informed on veganism and vegetarian, etc. But for those, often when you think protein, you think meat proteins.
Yeah.
And so I just maybe we could spend a minute on that in terms of easy vegetarian.
Yes, that's a really great question. Not only to your point about people veering a bit more to plant-based food, or that like gaining popularity, if you will, or becoming more mainstream maybe, but vegetarian sources of protein actually help to tick both the protein and fiber box in terms of the recommendations that I was mentioning. So most people, they get at meat and seafood. When it comes to vegetarian protein, the most substantial things that you're looking at are soy. So that one's very well known, and that can be in the form of tofu. It can also be in the form of tempeh, which is a source of protein, which is a source of fiber, but tempeh is also fermented. So it's adding those 3 layers of the 5 takeaways. So by eating tempeh instead of tofu, or doing both, right? It's not about replacing, you get the benefit of all 3 of those things. And if you've never had it before, it has like a nice nutty flavor and maybe a bit more of a meatier texture than tofu. So it's a nice alternative or a different option. And then in addition to that, the other 2 most prominent or largest sources of plant-based or vegetarian protein are beans and lentils. Now, any type of bean, any type of lentil, any color of lentil, or chickpeas, I'll also throw in there, often referred to as legumes as a category. They are all sources of vegetarian protein, and they're also sources of that fermentable fiber that you need to help build the probiotic bacteria in your gut. Although nuts and seeds do contain plant-based protein, just substantially, or like if we're just comparing the numbers, they're not going to provide as much as the other sources. So if we're looking at the heavy hitters or the big pieces of the puzzle, the soy, the beans, and the lentils are really the ones that I would prioritize in terms of vegetarian sources of protein.
Oh, great. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
All right. Well, we're going to end there. Thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. Thank all of you who've been joining us on this conversations, and thank you for your questions. It always makes for a more engaging and lively interaction. And as promised, we will be following this up with information on how to contact Stephanie and her 5 key takeaways. And again, if you want to do more of this, let us know, and let us know what you want to talk about. So have a good week. Thank you.